Welcome to the Ep31 podcast, the home for cultural chit-chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk. Welcome to the latest episode of the Ep31 podcast. Joining me in studio is, of course, Mary. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So we are liars, damned liars. We were supposed to be talking about Chernobyl in our non-interview podcast, and also we don't have anybody to interview this week, but we'll trundle on and try and make it as interesting as possible. So we've been doing a nice line in baby books. So easy to write. Where did you get the idea for this second edition? So if you remember, we did one last year for my sister's son, my nephew, obviously, and
mine.
Well, my sister's son is not your nephew.
No, and my nephew.
And your nephew.
Because they were born within 5 days of each other.
Oh, that's true, actually. Yeah, about some kind of duck or something, or a monkey.
A monkey. We did a bilingual edition.
We did, yeah.
Well, in Spanish and English, and in Irish and English.
The printing of the English edition turned out a little bit better than the Spanish edition.
Yeah, I don't know why.
But this book is for your brother's son.
Yeah, my nephew.
Your nephew, so Nephew Central.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to you with some ideas. I think he was so captured by the first book that he demanded a second one. Because the first one went to him as well, no?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Well, as I was saying to you off the microphone as well, this is a very important book because we've already written it. We just need to illustrate it. It's 10 pages long. It's about this epic journey of a boy who climbs up the stairs one step at a time. And then when he gets to the top, he's like, oh no, where's mummy? Or daddy, actually, in this case.
But don't tell them the whole story.
Don't worry. I mean, it's rich in detail when you read it. But as I was saying to you, our brains keep growing in our adolescence and our 20s. So if you read a Shakespeare play for the first time in your 30s or 40s, it's not going to have a profound change in your life because your personality is already set. But if we can get to the babies with this, amazing writing and with some deep lessons in there, then I think within a generation, no more war. So what you make of that?
Well, it might be a global solution.
Global solution.
Modern politics.
Well, I'll ask you as well. What did you read when you were a child, or do you remember what your parents read to you, if they read to you? Because my parents never read to me. Though they always encouraged me to read, though.
Yeah, of course.
They outsourced it to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was the same. No, my parents never read to me, for sure. I spend a lot of time writing myself, actually.
Yeah, me too.
Rather than I spent a lot of time reading, but when I was older. But when I was 6 or so, I spent a lot of time just inventing my own stories. And
yeah, I was very lucky. You showed me those before, and it was some kind of tabloid-esque newspaper, and you invented rumors about the celebrities of the day, and it was intriguing.
What?
It was intriguing because what you wrote made no sense either stylistically or factually, but that's like tabloids anyway. So
you're such a liar. I never wrote a tabloid.
You're like Princess Sophia, 42, was seen emerging from Disco de...
Que no.
Okay, we'll move on then. I used to do movies.
There were meaningful stories.
Meaningful, of course they were. I know they were. Conan O'Brien on his latest podcast said because he's Irish Catholic upbringing, deferred enjoyment. So he loved reading comics, but one summer he said to himself he wouldn't read them until the end of the summer. And then one day he had 30 comics to read, and he was like, "This is a mistake. I can't enjoy it now." And he had a comedian on as well who was from the Muslim faith, Kumail Nanjiani, who is quite famous now, and he did the same thing. But he was also kind of infamous this week for not turning up for Conan's show, and he had to interview his assistant. And I was just thinking, I mean, it actually turned out to be a great show. He just improvised, and his assistant is kind of famous anyway, Sonia Mosesian. But it just got me thinking that if you didn't turn up for our podcast, I would have to interview my assistant. But you are my assistant as well. So...
When I was in Egypt, you managed yourself for a few weeks. So.
That's true. And our numbers were pretty good as well, I think.
Not as good as when I was around, obviously.
Of course. Well, I remember we went to the Van Gogh movie when you came back. That was our first podcast post-Egypt. But yeah, so speaking of Egypt, actually, there's a guy who I want to show you. He's a YouTuber. And he started off his Africa vlog by going, Egypt is a very cultural country, famous for tourism. And that's why we're not going there. And he went to Western Sahara and the Gambia and these kind of countries on the western side and of Africa. And he took the longest train in the world. It's like 2 kilometers long across Western Sahara. And it was quite an amazing journey. He covered his face with kind of local head garb and like the iron ore which the train was transporting. That dust and the sand from the desert was kind of like blowing into him, and then at nighttime you could see the stars and everything as well. So it's kind of like an amazing remote country where you can do these like things, and the train was like almost, well, not in his case, but sometimes it's attacked by bandits because it's such a long train. It's very hard to defend. So if you had to tell me something wild and off the beaten path you could do in Egypt, do you have any idea what that could be?
Well, for example, the Dakhla Oasis is an oasis that not many people visit. Obviously, there are a few oases in Egypt. But the Dakhla Oasis that has a lot of traditional architecture that has remained the same since medieval times.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to get there. And it's obviously just deserted roads and all this, so it's a little bit dangerous maybe. For a while you couldn't really go, but yeah, I mean it's amazing because all the fabric of the villages has been preserved and everything is like really ancient and just like a different world.
I bet you've seen the Crooked Pyramid as well.
What?
This week in the news. There was something about a crooked pyramid. It's just like it changes direction or angle halfway up.
No, I haven't seen that.
No?
But,
Are you in denial? Because there's a crooked pyramid.
No, I mean, there's the step pyramid. Maybe that's the one they're talking about. I don't know. God knows.
Doing the Leaning Tower of Pisa before Pisa was a place. So I think it's enough bladder for part 1. We'll go to part 2 and we'll talk about photographs, New York City, and skyscrapers. Welcome to part 2 of the show. So this week has been quite cultural. We've been to 4 exhibitions, all of which have been, well, more or less photographic, apart from one. We'll start with the recent ones and work our way back to... actually, no, we can actually talk about a few more, because we have the photographic ones of the Civil War as well from last Thursday, or 2 Thursdays ago. So that's 5 exhibitions. Wow, it's going to be pretty meaty, this part. So we'll start with the Bellas Artes. We went there on Friday. Great mojito, mediocre pina colada. Staff even worse, but that's beside the point. So we went to the exhibition about Russia and kind of propaganda, things like that. The second exhibition was about the history of aviation in Spain. That was quite cool. And then finally, a surprise, we went in to see a domestic abuse exhibition. And it was a double surprise because we thought there was something else in there, and also there's a 12-year-old well, a student from university who looks
Poor
12,
guy.
manning the tickets and things like that. To be fair, he was quite nice though.
It's the
So,
summer.
so we'll start with that one maybe, just to start on a strong foot. I think because I think I have the clearest image of that, and then the other ones are a bit. Well, we can go into them maybe. So it was a surprise, as I said, and then you go in there and it has a huge impact. It's this woman who's been following people, taking photographs of these incidences of domestic abuse. So it's quite impactful, the photographs that she's taken. So yeah, that was I think I'd recommend that. But then you can go to the second floor. No, it's on the ground floor, and you can see the history of aviation in Spain. I've seen a similar one in Schiphol in Amsterdam. It's quite nice. We both liked it. So fancy chipping in there, starting us off on the old aviation there.
Well, it basically started with photos of the first flights that were done in Spain, and it kind of ended with some sort of futuristic views of what airports and airplanes will look like in the future. And yes.
No, continue.
And in between, there were a lot of pictures of famous people throughout the last few decades arriving in Spanish airports, which was quite funny in a way.
Well, it's funny because the Beatles came and they were wearing hats like bullfighters, and they were carrying flamenco dolls.
Yes.
And you were very impressed with that cultural.
Well, I don't know if impressed is the word. I was slightly mortified. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they got it as a present. I mean, to be fair, like they came in the 60s, so they could have just been truly told at the time that was like what they should carry away from here.
Well, yeah, you saw pictures of Gary Cooper as well, and the photograph, as I mentioned to you in the exhibition, is absolutely insane because he's famous for playing a cowboy in a western, maybe a few westerns, but he's definitely famous for one, High Noon, I think. Yes, High Noon. Which is High Noon, which is a famous Oscar-winning movie. I told you the anecdote that he plays a sheriff who's just got married, and my voice is breaking again. I've become a man, mazel tov. And a killer he put in jail a few years previously has come back to hunt him down, and all the townspeople turn their back on him, even though he's helped them. And he goes around trying to sway them and kind of convince them to help him. And it's basically an allegory for McCarthyism. And the only person who helps him eventually is his wife. And then he throws his sheriff's badge into the dirt. And he won an Oscar for that movie. John Wayne gave it to him, and then John Wayne called him a traitor, I think a year later, because of that scene in the movie. And the shot in the exhibition is quite amazing because it's shot from a low angle, as if he's in this town square. There's a clock tower even behind him, obviously, in Barajas Airport. It's like he's almost reaching for a gun as well. So I'm not sure if the photographer took this in mind or if it's just some kind of amazing coincidence, but just a very dramatic shot, and was quite nice. Another thing that was interesting, you mentioned it was the 50th thousandth or whatever visitors to the airport. You said this was a thing in Spain, probably elsewhere as well, but you remember this back in the day.
Yeah, well, no, not back in the day because this was in the 60s.
Doña Mary.
But, God. No, but I've seen it on TV that it was quite a thing, like in the 60s, on this thing of like a tourist number 1 million and things like that, and they gave them flowers and they gave them like food and stuff like that. I'm sure it happened in other places, but I don't know.
Well, the whole section on the celebrities, because that photograph was in that section of the celebrities.
Yeah.
They gave it a whole big sell. Actors or stars are coming from the heavens and they briefly touch our worlds, and then when they leave, all we have are the dreams, and the airports become these places.
Let's say that
let it down a little bit. But I know a guy who's like in his mid-50s, and he said like flying in Ireland in the 70s and 80s was a luxurious thing, like in the 60s in America. and you'd wear your best jeans or your best clothes when you were going on the plane. But now, obviously, it's changed a lot. But we did see what planes were like, especially first class flying, what that was like in the 70s and 80s with the food. The interiors were obviously terrible, but the food, you'd salt on the table, proper food, bottles of champagne. Yeah.
Proper glasses and cutlery. It was a bit insane, really.
Yeah, it was quite cool though. And also as well, we saw a picture of 3 people, an old woman, an old man, and a middle-aged man, who were taking their first flight from Cuatro Vientos, which is still an airport in Madrid, but now for the military, flying with Iberia, and they're flying from Madrid to Barcelona, I believe. You really loved that photograph.
That was my favorite thing in the exhibition, to be honest. I just found it really cute. I mean, the people were, well, I mean, were wearing suits and a hat. The woman was like quite elderly, and she was just wearing the typical Spanish kind of like all black. That obviously she was
like a shawl or something.
A widow, and then like just having this bun, her hair tied back like that, and she just looked so happy. And then I don't know, it just made me think, because in appearance you would have thought these people wouldn't be interested, or it wouldn't be something that they would do, but then they look really proud, and it was possibly something that they've been saving for a very, very long time.
Well, the guy in his 50s who I know said when he flew with his family, it was a talk of the neighborhood. Oh, they were on a plane. So imagine even back then it was, and this was back in 1922 or 3 when these flights were taking place, and when this old woman took her first flight, and she was probably born in the 1850s or 40s or 60s, I don't know, so like something crazy like that, where planes were not even a glint in anybody's eye back then, so yeah, that was a really tremendous part of the exhibition as well. So before we move on to the Russian section, is there anything that you'd like to say about the aviation parts?
No, just that I'm just thinking that it was all like made even more amusing by that man that was just going around doing like plane noises behind everybody.
Yeah, he was walking going, and then he'd walk out casually and go, ciao. Yeah, and he'd stop as well before the paint the pictures and take them in. He wouldn't be humming or anything like that, just when he's walking around. Well, there's fear of him, as my mother would say. So we go to the Russian part. And the Russian part was an interesting exhibition, but flawed. So again, you can take it away from here if you want, and I'll chip in with my insights, comrade.
This exhibition was on Russian propaganda, and it was supposed to be a continuation of one we saw last year.
Yeah.
It's all part of Foto España, which is a huge photography exhibition, an international one that takes place all over Madrid, and I'm sure other cities as well in Spain. And it's really interesting because basically there's just exhibitions all over the different cultural places across the city, and you can find many different things. For this one in particular, we went to the prequel, let's say, last year in the same place, but it was quite different. Last year it was photography, again also from Russia in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, but then this year it was mostly basically books and writing, and it was very strange because there was very little accompanying text. So for example, in the one that we just talked about, there was text, but it was unnecessary, really. I mean, you could see it and understand it without anything else, but in this one, without the text, it was hard to know what was going on because the books that were in the cabinets were obviously written in Russian, and
yeah, you couldn't make head or tail of it.
Yeah. Or at best you had the title translated into Spanish or into English, but there was no explanation as to how it all tied together.
Yes, like last year, it was full of photographs, as you mentioned, and photographs obviously say so much. I was telling you the other day about how paintings became more abstract because of the invention of photography, how the experience of life was distilled into shapes and ideas. Think of Kandinsky or things like that. And what I love about the Soviet Union, in terms of its culture and its propaganda, I just visually, there's a great aesthetic to it, leaving aside any kind of consideration of its politics. And the photographs that they took were for propaganda, but it was of World War II, of pilots, of peasants in bars, and they just took amazing photographs as if they had been staged for a movie. And so the quality of the images were high, but also their impact was impressive. And also you can tell, okay, well, this is why they're taking it, but it just had much more of an impact. And I feel like newspapers are interesting to analyse. I mean, I analyse newspapers for my dissertation, which came before my MPhil. Not quite a PhD like you have, but it's still very important. And I analysed newspapers of the 1913 lockout. But it's just like, and it is fascinating because there's a time until the mid 20th century where anybody could found a newspaper, and there is like an interesting element to that. And I was reading a book a few years ago of a Russian priest who was a dissident, and well, he was until he was finally broken by the Russian government, and he founded like several newspapers, and it's just a thing that you did. People like Patrick Kavanagh, Brendan Beaton, they founded newspapers in Ireland as well, literary ones, and in fact in UCC in the university there's a zine exhibition at the moment of people like around Cork who founded their own newspaper. So my whole point is like that it is an interesting part of history. And it is amazing because they're like early forms of blogs. It seems everybody could do one, is accessible, and it was a way to promote your ideas. That being said, though, I feel that, and maybe this is wrong, but I think obviously the written word was very fundamental in Russian propaganda. That's why books were censored, and why newspapers were so state controlled. Even during the Second World War, the banner underneath the headlines or the banner of the newspaper, it was something about death to the Germans or something like that, and that was removed only after World War II. So obviously they had their place in the machinery of the state, but I still feel that Russian propaganda was better visually, and there's less examples of that in this exhibition. What is interesting though about it is that we can compare it with another exhibition we saw another day, which was last Monday, which were photographs from Berenice Abbot, which she profiled New York quite famously in the 30s, also in the 20s as well. And the photographs of the Soviet Union are so obviously about a city and a country in transformation, which is what Abbott's photographs are about as well. But in the Soviet Union, it's just all about workers and steel output and coal output, while, and we'll talk about this a little bit later with Berenice Abbot, the profile of New York was far different and far more interesting as well. But even just the contrasting with other things, it has a huge element of interest. But a lot of it is inaccessible because it's in Russian text, and also because there's very little in the way of information panels on the walls as well. So I don't know. If I missed anything there.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so I think it's worth to see it because it's always nice to see primary sources if you like history. A lot of primary sources there. So I would recommend it. Yeah, I mean, it's flawed, but it's good. So Berenice Abbot, let's talk about her. She's an amazing figure. She was a woman photographer, which is significant back in the day as well. Not in the 60s when you were running around taking airplanes for the first time. And then she felt a calling to come back to America and go to New York City. She wasn't from there, but she felt a real need to profile it. And in fact, she was actually commissioned as well to take a lot of photographs, which I never knew. But it turns out there's actually a lot of photographs of New York in the 30s and 40s. I found this out in the research for this episode. And yes, we do research this sometimes. Other times it's off the cuff. stream of consciousness.
All the time. All the time.
Other times by 99%. But in fact, the tax office in New York City commissioned like just normal photographers to take pictures of buildings. And I mean, a lot of them weren't artistic, but you can see a city in a moment in time, and you can see Italian butchers posing outside a restaurant. Incidentally, Francis Ford Coppola wanted to shoot a mob murder for The Godfather in that restaurant, and the Italian owner didn't want the stigma of that, so refused for any movie to be shot there or any scene from a movie. There's another place which is connected thematically, which is like a restaurant, and there was a mob hit taken out there as well. Now it's some kind of fancy restaurant, but you can see the old lettering of the man's name above the facade of the modern establishment. And so I mean, just a treasure trove of pictures of New York in the 30s and 40s and 20s as well, I have to say. And it was a spectacular exhibition. I think we both really enjoyed it. Sometimes maybe the impact was muted because there might be many pictures of skyscrapers and we're not impressed by big buildings anymore. But back then, that was obviously more impressive and noteworthy and a symbol of a city that was growing and advancing, not just architecturally, but also scientifically as well, which was also formed part of her exhibition as well. Socially, not so much maybe, which I think is quite interesting because you can contrast. She loved contrasts, so she could contrast the social change for the better, for the worse, because remember the 30s was the Great Depression, and then the kind of the image of progress and money with these big buildings, no? So you could have a huge skyscraper and then next to it like a shanty town with people who'd lost their jobs during the Great Depression, or a bum or a homeless person asleep on a step. And a great photograph you might remember as well of a church surrounded by these towering skyscrapers. She said in Europe the church is the biggest building and then the other buildings are smaller, but here this church was this tiny object in comparison to these reaching skyscrapers. So there's more I can say about it, but I don't want to dominate too much. So what do you think about what I'm saying, or do you have anything new to say yourself?
No, I think we did discuss it after we saw it. You quite enjoyed in that it showed the change that was taking place at the time, and I mean, so did I, but I just missed that social element that you just mentioned. I think it got shown slightly, so just hints of it here and there. For example, in the people that you were talking about that were there in the shanty towns, or a few tramps, but it didn't really get explored, and I think it would have definitely been a huge part of it. I think something that I did find interesting was, for example, the photos of shops. It seemed like inconsequential, but then when you thought about it, they were showing the interior of shops that sold everything that you could possibly think of, which wasn't normal at the time. I mean, it was the first time that people started having access to such a wide range of things as we have nowadays. So I think both in that way and the construction process, it showed kind of like a new dimension of capitalism. I know at the time we did have a little chat about why I was insisting so much on capitalism, but I think those pictures were definitely showcasing a new level of that, and something that can see that the continuation can be seen nowadays, in the Western world, and especially in the States. So I think that was kind of like the germ of or the origin of all these things afterwards. Yeah, all in all interesting, but I would have preferred a more holistic picture and like a more human-based one.
Okay, well, it's interesting what you say about the shops, because, well, our old shops tour, Lev PS, 5 stars we've gotten from one woman from Finland on Airbnb. So I don't know what the finish for thank you is, so thank you. But also, it was fascinating because in the photographs you do see cars sharing roads with horse and cart. And she, as I said before, she loved the contrast, and this was also elements of contrast. She even said as well before that that not every photograph was beautiful, but it could still be artistic. But it's very hard to be artistic when you're taking a picture of a shop front. So what she was looking for was contrast, depth, profundity, perspective, all these different things. And you can see her technical attributes there, because there's also another photograph she took of a skyscraper from a skyscraper at nighttime of the city, and all the other skyscrapers full of light. And she described going up to the top of one of the skyscrapers and setting up her camera and the exposure, because of course it was a long time ago, so this took a long time to set up. And what was interesting is, like, she mentions that she only had a short window of time to do it because the people would have left work at 5 o'clock and the lights would be off by maybe 5:30, while now that wouldn't really be an issue. So that contrast was interesting, but also just how she sets up her shots. There's always like a technical application to it, or a filter that she's trying to shoot through. But also, as you mentioned, just to see this kind of world that doesn't exist anymore, rope shops and things like that. But also just to see, these, I guess there are rope shops, but like, you know what I mean, these old-timey rope shops that don't exist anymore, and other things that are definitely of another world. And these are kind of like DIY shops that, yes, I understand we still had DIY shops before you jump in, but again, like selling things that we just don't use anymore. So that aspect was quite interesting. Also, I think she showed the skin of the city. A great photograph was of the Empire State Building, or the other one, which was Rockefeller Center, where you could see the legs of the building underneath the ground. And she was like saying that the men always found that fascinating, but women didn't. And she's like, I don't know why, because it's very interesting to see it.
She was a woman and she found it fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm just quoting her. But what's interesting though as well is that she showed the skin of the city and the skeleton of the city, and conceptually, I'm sure a lot of those buildings would have been difficult to understand. Like, the scale was breathtaking, but also she took a lot of scientific photographs, which I think was staggering, because she took these like high resolution images of electricity and kineticism that seems technically very hard to pull off, and even conceptually to understand for a lot of people back then, I think, because these were new concepts. And she took photographs of these things. It was staggering. I mean, I wasn't impressed in a photographic sense, but I have to doff my cap, buy her some old-timey ropes, I don't know, and say, great photograph. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right?
No. What are you talking about? Yes, I think in every exhibition or in every retrospective of the entire work of an artist, there's always a section at the end of like rarities or things that they normally do at the end of their lives that are completely different to what they've done before, which is fair enough, because I guess when you are more established, you have more opportunities to do other things that you might not be able to do at the beginning, or even to afford to be able to do. So I think some of them were interesting. It just seemed a bit bizarre to see it at the end of the rest of the exhibition, because obviously it had nothing to do. They were just like, I don't know, for example, magnetic shavings, things like that. So it was alright. It just wasn't, for me, it wasn't really connected to what you've seen before. So to be honest, if it wasn't because we had seen the documentary right at the beginning that explained a little bit about what her motives were and so on, I would have thought it was quite strange to have those photos there.
Okay, that's right. It's very true. Also, just other examples of her contrast and her depth of vision. Photographs of people in plazas, underneath the elevated train, things like that. In Times Square, you can see old-timey adverts, which are quite interesting, because you can recognize the beats of the advert, but it's obviously expressed in in a more formal sense. Holidays are a terrific adventure when you save with Savings Bank, things like that. And also as well as herself, before she went to France and before she went back to New York, she fell in with this kind of bohemian crowd that felt that they didn't really fit in. This kind of individualism is interesting because it is something that I think we associate with Americans in general, but also in terms of like this identity hunt, which you can kind of find in Jack Kerouac as well, and wouldn't be out of place in some kind of blogger or influencer today either. So I think, just kind of more current reverberations as well through her work that we can kind of see things like that today as well. So we'll finish part 2 by talking about the exhibition we saw 2 Thursdays ago, which of course in the podcast realm has no meaning. Time is an illusion here. But for us, of course, you know what I'm referring to, which was the 2 photographs in the Spanish Civil War. One photographer was on the Republican side and the other on the Franco side. So, seeing the set.
Okay. Well, the exhibition was kind of advertised as a contrasting view of the Civil War. So, the aim, or the blurb on the website that talked about the exhibition, basically what it said was, the aim of it is just to show how no matter what side you were on, the normal population, normal people were the ones that suffered, were the ones that were lacking food, were lacking everything, health. So I think the point was just trying to say, let's forget about politics and just like focused on social issues and the suffering. As a concept, I thought it was very interesting because it is true that, and for the Spanish Civil War, it certainly is true as well, that, well, many people, I think it always happens, you fall on one side or the other, and you just find yourself there trying to look after the children, the family, the elderly, and it's basically out of your hands whether you are on the winning side or the losing side, geographically speaking anyway. But then, as a premise, I thought it was interesting because I was very curious to see how that was gonna be shown, especially bearing in mind that obviously there was a winning side in the end, and I was just curious to see, what part of the Civil War they were going to focus on and how they were going to be able to show a measured portrait of the Civil War in terms of the impact on people. Then I didn't find that was the issue because I didn't really find that contrasting view very much when we went to the exhibition. There were lots of interesting pictures, lots of things that, lots of documented aspects of it, and lots of visually and aesthetically, inspiring views. But in reality, really, one of the photographers had many more pictures than the other one, which was the one on the Republican side.
Constantino, Suarez.
And it was just as well because his pictures, I think we both found, were a lot better than the other ones in terms of,
Well, the guy on the Facha side, the other side, was he had one of his photographs was taken from his shop door. Okay, fair enough. There's an action that was happening maybe 30 meters from his shop, so why wouldn't you? But a lot of his photographs just seem like he's just walking up to it, pointing the camera and pressing click. While with Suarez, there's like different angles, and there's like they're not only angles, but just also his distance. Sometimes he's closer and farther away to capture a certain mood or an aesthetic in an unfolding tragedy or drama. And from an artistic element, it's absolutely amazing. There's one scene I can remember where there's soldiers against a wall, and one guy's just looking back, And that's shot in a really interesting way. And other people are kind of queuing up for food, and it's just like at an angle, and all you can see are the hands holding all the pots, you know, and that's just something different. There's scenes in bars or people like having food over a fire, and again, it's just kind of like rich. There's just great lighting, and it's dramatic. There's just a scene there. There seems to be a story suggested by the characters, and the photograph, and there's also another one. I think I can't remember exactly, but it's of a group of people again queuing, and one woman just kind of looking behind, looking at him, and just because of like his place in relation to her, there's like a depth in the image that is quite interesting and kind of elevates into something that's more narrative than just a photograph that's doesn't really have great lighting, doesn't really say much. It's just more a representation of he's just pointing and clicking basically, you know. So I think there's more artistry in Suarez's hands than in the others photographers' hands.
Yeah, I think precisely that picture that you were talking about in the queue to get some food, and the last woman is just looking at him, and the others, you know, are just talking to each other, looking down. I think it really captures the mood, and it makes you feel like, you know, you're the last one standing in that queue, and it's much easier to get the idea of what's going on and the relevance for people. In some areas of the exhibition, they basically try to put two pictures together, as in giving two views of the same thing from either side, which they were only able to do in certain instances, but I think that was the whole aim of the exhibition. But this picture that you talked about was in contrast with another one from the Franco side. And I told you at the time, I thought it was very striking because on the one hand, there was this one that we've talked about, which really showed the reality of things. And then the other picture basically showed a queue also of a couple of women, kind of like trying to get food of soldiers. And basically the soldiers just being in a mocking, not a mocking attitude, but kind of like a, I don't know, flirting attitude or whatever, like clearly humiliating her because she seemed quite, coy, and it's kind of like a bit sad because it wasn't a picture, you know, that showed that reality as in a denouncing way, of course. It almost felt as if he found it an amusing moment, you know, that like life went on and this was like, I don't know, a typical thing of that you would find later on maybe in the 50s or 60s of, well, this is so much fun, you know, these people flirting. It reminded me of that photo that there is of Italy, of like a woman walking down the street and there's like three men kind of like, well, whistling at her or something, and she looks quite coy. And I thought, well, like this is a completely wrong context for this picture because it sort of like deviates the attention completely from the issue that these people had no food, you know, and this woman has like some really young people behind and other men behind as well that are just waiting to get the ration. So it seems almost like a bit cruel to me.
Abuse of power.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, a photograph from Italy, is that from the past as well, or?
From probably from the 50s or 60s, I think.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting sideline as well. You could diverge into modern politics like with that as well, but we'll focus on the era at hand. So yeah, overall, very stimulating exhibition. I think if Suarez, for example, had if a Republican photographer had taken a photograph of that scene, perhaps with the lighting or the angle or some other kind of technique, the same scene would have been represented maybe with more tenderness or maybe more empathy. I mean, I don't know, but perhaps because of his skill with the camera, it would have transmitted something else. I don't know if that's fair enough or not, but
it's possible because, to be honest, I thought it was almost lazy, you know, to focus on that detail, and it was just an anecdote. It was something specific, while the other photo was basically showing a routine, because that same idea of like people queuing and the faces of like despair your point of view being of the last person in the queue would have been a routine thing every day during the Civil War and in post-war Spain.
Well, maybe it's a subtle thing as well, that it wasn't the intention of the photograph to suggest this, but if you look at propaganda of the Republican side, you'd have men and women fighting together, and it was a bit more egalitarian, while here, and not only is it an abuse of power in terms of soldiers doing this in any context or war or country, but probably a lot of them felt, well, you're less than, and not only because you're a woman, but you're possibly a Republican, I don't know, but we run this place, and
I completely agree with you.
So there's that kind of reading of it as well that could be interpreted in such a way. I think also what was interesting is that we saw the one of the photographers' suitcase and his equipment, his camera reels, how they were stored as well, and just kind of gave a bit of a picture of how they went from place to place and took their photographs, which also Robert Capa, the great, well, depending on who you talk to, Civil War photographer, kept a lot of his photographs in suitcases as well. So it's kind of like an interesting curiosity of the practicalities of doing that type of job at that era as well. So I think that's us for part 2. We're all exhibitioned out. So we went from Spanish aviation to photographs to the Civil War. Hope you enjoyed it. Now it's time for a musical interlude, and of course the obligatory, inevitable part 3. Welcome to part 3 of the show. If you are in Madrid or just fancy an audio guide for a city you've never even been in, go to the App Store and check out our updated LARPA audio guide, Madrid Tour. We fell foul of the privacy regulations, so we had to rejig the whole thing. But now, Mary, you can plug the usual things.
Well, the app, if you're looking at the moment, is only in the Play Store. We haven't done the iOS version yet. But if you look up El Arpa Media Madrid Audio Guides, you should find it. And, we are on Twitter at El Arpa1, on Instagram at El Arpa.
And our podcast on any platform as well, and our blog, IrishLightsOfMadrid.com. So thank you very much for listening to this latest edition of the El Arpa podcast. Tune in next week for the latest episode, and well, good luck.
Bye.
The El Arpa podcast, the home for cultural chit chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk.